The glass in her hand didn't shake. That was the first thing Marianne Hale noticed as her husband finished speaking. The crystal tumbler rested against her palm, cool and heavy, catching the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Inside it, the amber liquid barely rippled. No tremor, no spill, no outward sign that something inside her had just been cut loose. Richard didn't see that. He stood a few feet away, adjusting his cufflinks with the same calm precision he used in boardrooms and interviews. His voice hadn't risen. It never did. He didn't need volume to land his words where they hurt most. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said evenly, as if delivering a quarterly report. At dinner, Marianne looked at the carpet instead of his face. The pattern was familiar. Cream and slate woven into something tasteful and forgettable. She'd walked across it hundreds of times. Tonight it felt like neutral ground. "You spoke too much," Richard continued. "You asked questions that didn't need to be asked. People noticed." There it was. People noticed. Not I felt uncomfortable. Not I was bothered. People. As if the room full of investors and guests had reached a collective conclusion about her worth and handed it to him to announce. He exhaled lightly, the way someone does when they believe they're being patient. "You should learn when to stay quiet," he added. "It suits you better." The words settled into the room slowly, like dust after something shatters, but hasn't yet been acknowledged. Marianne waited. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to explain. She didn't list the careful things she'd done that evening, the seating arrangements, the dietary notes she'd memorized, the way she'd redirected conversations to make him look good. She didn't remind him that the question he'd found so offensive had earned nods from the table. She didn't do any of that. Because something inside her had gone very still. For a moment, Richard expected the usual response. A soft apology. A nod of agreement. Maybe even a nervous laugh meant to smooth the moment over. That was how it usually went. That was the rhythm of their marriage. But Marianne didn't reach for it. She nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. As if he'd spoken, and she'd heard him. And that was where the exchange would end. She set the glass down on the dresser with care. Picked up her phone. Stepped past him without looking up. Richard turned, confused. "Marianne." She didn't answer. She walked out of the bedroom, her heels quiet against the hallway floor, her back straight, her breathing measured. At the guest room door, she paused only long enough to turn the handle. No explanation, no defense, no permission asked. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Inside the guest room, she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, still wearing her evening dress. The silence of the house pressed in around her, not empty but full. Full of space she'd never allowed herself to take. She lay down without changing. Stared at the ceiling. Let the quiet do its work. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because she was done giving her pain an audience. Marianne hadn't always known how to do this. For most of her life, she believed love required effort in one direction. She learned early that being easy was praised. That harmony mattered more than honesty. That discomfort, especially her own, was something to be managed quietly. Her mother had been kind in the way women were taught to be kind. She smoothed tensions. She swallowed opinions. She called it grace. Marianne absorbed that lesson before she had words for it. In school, teachers loved her because she never caused trouble. In her first job, supervisors relied on her because she never said no. In relationships, men stayed longer because she made herself smaller. And when she met Richard Hale, she mistook certainty for care. Richard moved through the world like someone accustomed to agreement. He didn't demand it. He simply expected it. People adjusted themselves around him without realizing they were doing it. At first, Marianne found that reassuring. He made decisions easily. He spoke with confidence. He seemed unshaken by doubt. After years of tiptoeing around other people's needs, she thought she'd found someone solid enough to lean on. She didn't notice how quickly leaning became disappearing. The first time he corrected her in public, it was subtle. A raised eyebrow. A redirected sentence. She laughed it off. The second time, she apologized, though she couldn't remember exactly why. By the third time, she'd started editing herself before she spoke. Tonight wasn't the first humiliation. It was the first one she refused to absorb. Down the hall, Richard stood alone in the bedroom longer than he meant to. This wasn't how it usually went. Marianne always came back. Always explained. Always softened the edges so he didn't have to. The quiet unsettled him. Not because it was loud, but because it was firm. The next morning came too quickly. Sunlight poured into the dining room, reflecting off polished surfaces and expensive glassware. The long table was set perfectly, as always. Coffee steamed. Conversations bloomed easily among guests, friends, family, investors. Marianne entered the room calmly. She wasn't dressed to impress. She wore something simple, comfortable, intentional. Richard glanced up, expecting something, hesitation maybe. An apology, waiting to be offered quietly once the guests left. He didn't get it. Marianne greeted everyone warmly, took her seat, poured her coffee, and when someone asked her a question, she answered it. Not defensively, not loudly, just clearly. When someone tried to interrupt her, she paused, and continued. She didn't challenge Richard. She didn't defer to him either. She simply stayed present. The table noticed, not because she made a scene, but because dignity has weight. It changes the air without announcing itself. Conversations slowed. Eyes lingered. Richard felt it then, the subtle shift he couldn't quite name. Something had moved. And it wasn't going back. Marianne didn't feel powerful. She felt steady. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Marianne stayed at the table longer than she needed to. Not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she was learning what it felt like not to retreat. The conversation moved on without her having to fight for space. Someone asked about a gallery opening downtown. Another guest mentioned a recent article Richard's company had been featured in. Marianne listened, nodded, spoke when she had something to add, and let the rest pass without chasing it. Across from her, Richard watched with a polite half-smile fixed to his face. Anyone else would have thought nothing was wrong. He looked composed, attentive, the same man he always was in public. But Marianne saw the difference. He wasn't leading the room anymore. He was monitoring it. When breakfast ended, guests filtered out slowly, lingering in small clusters. Compliments were exchanged. Plans were made. And then, just like that, the house emptied, leaving behind the echo of chairs scraping softly against the floor. Richard stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the polished wood. That was unexpected, he said. Marianne gathered her plate. Was it? He hesitated, as if choosing words. You were very present this morning. She met his gaze for the first time since the night before. Her expression wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was calm in a way that didn't ask to be understood. I always am, she said. Then she turned toward the sink. Richard didn't follow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. That, too, was unusual. He was used to discussions ending with her softening, not solidifying. Marianne rinsed her plate slowly, aware of how grounded she felt in her own body. No rush, no apology forming at the back of her throat. Just the quiet certainty that something had shifted, and that she didn't need to explain it for it to be real. Later that afternoon she left the house alone. The park near their home was nothing special, just a stretch of green bordered by tall trees and walking paths worn smooth by time. She chose a bench in the shade, and sat, hands folded in her lap, listening to the sounds of other people living ordinary lives. Children laughing. A couple arguing softly as they walked. Someone on a phone call, pacing. Marianne let herself feel the weight of the moment, without rushing to name it. She thought about all the times she'd swallowed words to keep peace. All the apologies she'd offered simply because it was easier than standing firm. She remembered the quiet pride people had taken in her flexibility, how often she'd been praised for being understanding, agreeable, low maintenance. No one had ever asked what it cost her. And she'd never asked herself either. Until now. It wasn't that she suddenly felt brave. Courage implies a rush, a surge of adrenaline. What she felt was steadier than that. Like standing on ground she'd been avoiding for years, and realizing it could hold her weight just fine. Back at the house, Richard noticed the difference too. It showed up in small things. Marianne didn't adjust her schedule to accommodate his last-minute changes. She didn't rush to fill silences with reassurance. When he spoke sharply, she didn't soften to compensate. She didn't confront him. She didn't need to. The absence of her usual self-erasure spoke louder than any argument. That evening, they shared a meal in near silence. Not tense, not hostile. Just different. Richard glanced at her once, then twice, as if trying to locate the version of his wife he was used to navigating around. Marianne ate slowly, aware of her posture, her breath, the way she no longer felt braced for impact. She slept in the guest room again that night. And the night after that, not as punishment, not as leverage. But because space, she was learning, was not abandonment. Sometimes it was clarity. As days passed, memories surfaced more clearly, moments she'd once dismissed as insignificant. The first job where her ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else. The relationship before Richard, where she'd stayed longer than she should have because leaving felt like failure. The subtle praise she'd received for being low drama, which really meant low resistance. Marianne began to see the pattern not with shame, but with understanding. She had been taught, carefully, quietly, that love was something you earned by minimizing yourself. And she had believed it. That belief had shaped her choices more than any single person ever had. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the study, she found a notebook from years ago. Early marriage. Early hope. Inside were half-written thoughts. Plans she'd once considered pursuing. Ideas she'd set aside because they didn't fit the life she was building. She read them without judgment. Not mourning who she'd been, but recognizing her. That night, Richard finally spoke what had been hovering between them. "You've changed," he said. Marianne looked up from the book she was reading. "I haven't," she replied. "I've just stopped editing." He frowned, as if the concept itself irritated him. "I don't understand why you're doing this." She considered that, then shook her head gently. "I know." That was the truth of it. Understanding wasn't required for her boundary to stand. The conversation ended there. No resolution, no apology. But something important had happened. Marianne had chosen herself without demanding permission. And that choice, quiet, firm, unannounced, was already reshaping everything. She didn't know yet where it would lead. She only knew where it wouldn't take her anymore. Not back to silence that erased her. Not back to explanations that went unheard. Whatever came next would have to meet her where she stood. And for the first time she trusted herself enough to stay there. If this moment resonated with you, if you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, pause for a second and reflect. Have you ever swallowed your truth to protect a relationship that wasn't protecting you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you're drawn to love stories that honor self-respect, emotional growth, and real-life lessons, make sure to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. There's more ahead you won't want to miss. Marianne used to think she was born quiet. Not shy, just naturally accommodating. The kind of person who listened more than she spoke. Who noticed moods in a room and adjusted herself accordingly. For years she believed this was temperament. Personality. Something neutral. It took her a long time to understand it was training. Growing up, her house was rarely loud. There were no slammed doors or shouting matches. Conflict didn't explode. It dissolved. It disappeared into polite smiles and unfinished sentences. Her parents believed deeply in keeping things pleasant, and unpleasant feelings were treated like messes to be cleaned up quickly. Her mother, Evelyn, was admired by everyone. "She's so gracious," people would say. "So patient. So understanding." Marianne heard those words often, watching her mother glide through conversations, smoothing tensions before they had time to surface. Evelyn never raised her voice. She never demanded. She simply adapted. At the dinner table, if Marianne disagreed with something her father said, her mother would place a gentle hand on her knee beneath the table. Not a warning. A reminder. This isn't the place. Later, alone in the kitchen, Evelyn would explain softly, "Some things don't need to be said out loud. Peace is more important than being right." Marianne nodded every time. She learned that love came with instructions. Be considerate. Be flexible. Don't make things harder than they need to be. When she did well in school, the praise came easily. Teachers liked her because she never disrupted class. Group projects always went smoothly because Marianne took on the extra work without complaint. If someone else took credit, she told herself it didn't matter. She didn't need recognition. She needed approval. By the time she reached her teenage years, Marianne was skilled at reading the emotional weather of a room. She knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. If a friend was upset, Marianne listened without centering herself. If a disagreement arose, she softened her stance to keep things calm. Adults praised her maturity. What they didn't see was how often she swallowed disappointment without letting it touch her face. In college, that skill only sharpened. Marianne studied hard, worked part-time, and rarely asked for help. When professors overlooked her contributions, she assumed it was her responsibility to try harder. When roommates crossed boundaries, she negotiated quietly instead of insisting. She believed self-sufficiency was a virtue. She also believed discomfort was something you endured silently if you wanted to be liked. Her first serious relationship followed the same pattern. Daniel, another Daniel, years before the one who would later change everything, was charming and ambitious. He liked that Marianne was low maintenance, that she didn't ask for much, that she didn't get upset easily. When plans changed last minute, she adjusted. When he forgot important dates, she reminded herself he was busy. When she felt lonely beside him, she told herself relationships weren't meant to feel easy all the time. When it ended, he told her, "You're great. I just didn't feel challenged." She smiled through the breakup and wished him well. Only later did she realize what he meant. She hadn't challenged him because she'd never challenged anything. After college, Marianne took a job in nonprofit administration. The work mattered to her. She believed in the mission. She stayed late, volunteered for extra projects, and rarely turned down requests. Her supervisors trusted her, which often meant they leaned on her. When budgets were tight, Marianne absorbed the workload. When credit was distributed, her name appeared in small print, if at all. When she raised concerns, she did so gently, carefully framing them so no one felt uncomfortable. "You're such a team player," her manager told her once, smiling. Marianne took that as praise. It wasn't until years later that she understood what it had cost her. By the time Richard entered her life, Marianne was already fluent in self-adjustment. She knew how to bend without breaking, or so she thought. Richard's certainty felt like relief. His decisiveness felt like protection. He didn't ask her to shrink. He just didn't notice when she did. And because she'd spent a lifetime learning that love and approval came from making herself easy to be around, she stepped neatly into the space he left for her. At first it felt like partnership. Only later did it begin to feel like erasure. Sitting alone now, years into that marriage, Marianne could finally see the pattern with clarity. She hadn't been weak. She had been taught. Taught that self-respect was negotiable, that harmony mattered more than honesty. That love was something you preserved by staying agreeable. Understanding that didn't fill her with anger. It filled her with resolve. Because learned patterns could be unlearned. And for the first time in her life, Marianne wasn't interested in being easy. She was interested in being whole. By the time Marianne met Richard Hale, she was already an expert at adapting. She didn't think of it that way then. She thought she was simply considerate, flexible, mature enough to understand that relationships required compromise, that people came with edges, and smoothing those edges was part of loving them well. Richard noticed those qualities immediately. They met at a fundraising dinner, one of many she attended for work. He was composed, confident, and unmistakably powerful in the way people leaned toward him when he spoke. Marianne remembered how he listened without interrupting, how his attention felt deliberate. When he asked questions, they were precise. When he smiled, it felt earned. He didn't overwhelm her. He didn't chase her. He simply assumed space, and she stepped neatly into it. Their early conversations were easy. Richard liked that Marianne didn't push, didn't pry, didn't need reassurance every 5 minutes. He told her she was refreshing. Different. Not like the women who demanded constant attention or dramatized small disagreements. Marianne took that as a compliment. When they began dating, she noticed how quickly plans took shape around Richard's schedule. His meetings, his travel, his priorities. It didn't bother her. She told herself that was normal. He had responsibilities after all. She had learned long ago that love often meant accommodating someone else's weight. If she suggested a restaurant and he preferred another, she deferred. If she wanted a quiet weekend and he booked a last-minute trip, she adapted. Each choice felt small, reasonable, hardly worth discussing. And so she didn't. The first time Richard corrected her in front of someone else, it happened so smoothly she almost missed it. She'd been telling a story at a dinner party, nothing personal, just an anecdote about a project she'd worked on. Richard smiled, touched her arm lightly and said, "What Marianne means is," before finishing the sentence for her. The table laughed politely. The conversation moved on. Later that night, Marianne told herself she was being sensitive. He probably hadn't meant anything by it. He was just clarifying. The second time, he corrected her tone. "You sounded defensive," he said afterward, not unkindly. "People might misinterpret that." She apologized. She didn't ask why her feelings had to be adjusted for other people's comfort. Over time, those moments accumulated. Never enough to justify confrontation, always subtle enough to dismiss. And because Marianne had been trained to minimize her own discomfort, she absorbed them quietly. She told herself this was marriage. That compromise was a sign of commitment. That love meant choosing harmony over friction. But harmony, she was learning, can be one-sided. Richard rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His power lived in certainty. In the way decisions seemed final before they were discussed. In the way rooms adjusted themselves around him. Marianne adjusted too. She began rehearsing sentences in her head before speaking. Editing questions. Softening opinions. When she sensed irritation, she retreated. When she felt dismissed, she swallowed it. Not because Richard demanded it, but because her entire life had taught her that being easy was safer than being honest. At work, the pattern continued. Marianne advanced in responsibility but not in recognition. She became indispensable in ways that went unnoticed. When colleagues leaned on her, she held steady. When promotions passed her by, she told herself the work itself mattered more. "You're so reliable," people said. Reliable became a cage she decorated with patience. It wasn't until years into her marriage that the cost of all that adaptation began to surface in quiet, unexpected ways. She felt tired even when she rested. She felt lonely even when she wasn't alone. She caught herself hesitating before speaking, even with people who meant her no harm. There were moments, brief, disorienting moments, when she didn't recognize the version of herself she was presenting to the world. Still, she stayed. Because leaving felt like failure. Because questioning the marriage felt disloyal. Because she'd been taught that endurance was noble. And because Richard, for all his flaws, never shouted. Never cheated. Never crossed the kinds of lines people pointed to as obvious deal breakers. The erosion was quieter than that. It happened in the pauses. In the silences. In the unspoken understanding that some parts of her were less welcome than others. Marianne didn't realize how far she'd drifted until the night in the bedroom, the night something in her refused to bend one more time. Sitting alone now, reflecting on all of it, she felt something unfamiliar but grounding, compassion for herself. She hadn't chosen this pattern consciously. She had inherited it, reinforced it, lived inside it because it once kept her safe. Understanding that didn't excuse what she'd tolerated, but it freed her from shame. She could see clearly now that self-respect wasn't something you stumbled into, it was something you practiced. And like any skill, it could atrophy if neglected. Marianne had neglected it for years. The realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with anger or bitterness. It arrived quietly, like a truth she was finally ready to hold. She wasn't difficult. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't wrong for wanting to be heard. She had simply learned to disappear where she should have stood. And now, slowly, deliberately, she was learning something else. That love built on silence eventually collapses under its own weight. That respect begins where self-abandonment ends. That peace without dignity is just another kind of loneliness. Marianne didn't know yet how her marriage would end, or if it would. But she knew this much with certainty. Whatever love came next, whether with Richard or without him, it would have to meet her whole. Because she was done being easy. She was ready to be real. Richard proposed on a Tuesday. Not because it was romantic, but because it was efficient. They were sitting in a quiet restaurant overlooking the city, the kind of place where reservations were secured weeks in advance, and no one ever rushed you out. Richard had just finished describing a new expansion his company was planning. Numbers, timelines, projections delivered with calm authority. Marianne listened, nodding at the right moments, her wine untouched. When he reached into his jacket pocket, she assumed he was grabbing his phone. Instead, he placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "I don't see a reason to wait," he said simply. "We work well together. We're aligned. Marriage makes sense." The word sense hovered in the air. Marianne stared at the box, surprised by how little her heart raced. There was no swell of music in her chest. No cinematic pause. Just a quiet warmth, mixed with relief. She told herself that was maturity. She told herself that certainty was better than fireworks. Richard didn't get down on one knee. He didn't give a speech. He didn't ask how she felt. He watched her instead, confident in the outcome, as if this were a conclusion already reached. Marianne smiled and said yes. Later, people would tell her how lucky she was. He was successful. Stable. Respected. A man who knew what he wanted. Friends praised her for finding someone so grounded, so decisive. Her mother cried softly and said, "You'll never have to worry with him." And Marianne believed that. In the early months of marriage, Richard's certainty felt like shelter. He handled logistics effortlessly. Decisions were made quickly. Plans unfolded smoothly. Marianne found comfort in not having to fight for direction. She told herself that letting someone else lead wasn't the same as losing herself. At first it wasn't. But slowly, almost invisibly, the shape of their life began to form around Richard's expectations. His routines, his social circle, his version of what was appropriate, impressive, acceptable. Marianne adjusted without complaint. When guests came over, she learned which topics Richard preferred she avoid. When events required her presence, she learned how to present herself, polished, agreeable, supportive. She became skilled at anticipating what would reflect well on him. Richard noticed. "You're good at this," he told her once after a dinner party. "You understand how things work." She felt proud. What she didn't notice then was how often this meant shrinking herself into a role rather than expanding into a partner. Disagreements, when they occurred, were handled quietly. Richard disliked emotional messiness. He valued composure above all else. If Marianne expressed frustration, he framed it as inefficiency. "You're overthinking," he'd say. "There's no need to make this complicated. Let's be practical." Marianne learned to translate her feelings into calmer language, or to silence them altogether. And because Richard never raised his voice, never slammed doors, never made demands outright, it was easy to tell herself she was being unreasonable for wanting more space to speak. From the outside, their marriage looked ideal. From the inside, it was orderly. And order, she was learning, can feel like safety until you realize it leaves no room to breathe. The first time Marianne sensed something was wrong, it wasn't during a conflict. It was during a compliment. "You make everything easier," Richard told her one evening, kissing her forehead absently as he checked his phone. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled. But something in her tightened. Because easier didn't feel the same as seen. She pushed the thought aside. Told herself she was being ungrateful. Told herself this was what partnership looked like. Support, efficiency, reliability. She reminded herself of the alternative: chaos, uncertainty, emotional volatility. Richard was none of those things. So she stayed quiet. Over time, the corrections became more frequent. Not harsh. Just precise. "Let me handle that. That's not how I'd phrase it. People might misread what you're saying." Each time, Marianne adjusted. Each time she told herself it was small. Until the night it wasn't. Until the words in the bedroom landed not as advice, but as dismissal. Until something in her refused to translate humiliation into patience anymore. Looking back now, Marianne could see it clearly. She hadn't married cruelty. She had married certainty, and mistaken it for care. And certainty, unchecked, had slowly crowded out her voice. The realization didn't come with rage. It came with clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave quietly. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no single argument, no dramatic rupture that marked the moment Marianne became more of a reflection than a partner. It happened quietly, through repetition. Through the slow replacement of intimacy with image. Richard's world expanded rapidly after the marriage. His company grew. His name appeared in articles more frequently. Invitations arrived daily. Fundraisers, panels, private dinners, where everyone seemed to know exactly who he was. Marianne became part of that landscape. At first, she enjoyed it. The elegance, the conversations, the feeling of stepping into rooms where decisions were made. She told herself she was lucky to witness it up close, to support someone building something meaningful. But over time she noticed how differently Richard spoke to her in those spaces. Not unkindly. Just carefully. He would place a hand at the small of her back to guide her. Subtle, almost affectionate, but always directional. When she spoke, his eyes tracked reactions around the room more than her words. If she lingered too long on a thought, he'd gently interject, steering the conversation somewhere safer. Later, in the car, he'd offer feedback. "You did well tonight," he'd say. "Just, next time, maybe keep it lighter." Or, "You don't need to explain so much. People don't really care about the details." At first, Marianne listened. She trusted him. He understood these rooms better than she did, after all. She didn't ask why her details were the ones being trimmed. As months passed, the feedback became expectation. She learned which stories were acceptable, which opinions landed well, which questions might disrupt the rhythm of an evening. She adjusted her tone, her posture, even her laughter. Not because Richard demanded it outright, but because the alternative felt like friction. And friction, she'd learned, was something to be avoided if you wanted peace. At home, their conversations narrowed. Richard talked about work, Strategy, risk, expansion. Marianne listened, offering encouragement, asking questions that aligned with his focus. When she spoke about her own work or thoughts, the responses were brief. "That's good," he'd say. "Sounds handled. Let's talk about it later." Later rarely came. She began to notice how often she paused mid-sentence, waiting for confirmation before continuing. How often she softened statements with disclaimers. "Maybe I'm wrong, but it's probably not important, but..." Richard didn't notice those changes. Why would he? The system worked. Their marriage ran smoothly. No raised voices. No public conflicts. Friends admired them. Colleagues praised Marianne's composure and supportiveness. "She's perfect for you," someone once told Richard within earshot. Low drama. Richard smiled. Marianne smiled too, but that night, lying beside him in the dark, she stared at the ceiling and wondered when drama had become synonymous with having a voice. The imbalance grew clearest during disagreements. When Marianne raised concerns, about time, about distance, about the way she felt increasingly invisible, Richard responded with logic. "You're taking this personally. This isn't about you. There's no reason to be emotional." He wasn't cruel. He didn't dismiss her outright. He reframed her feelings until they seemed inefficient, misplaced, unnecessary. Marianne began to doubt herself. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she was asking for too much. She didn't want to be another problem in his already demanding life. So she tried harder. She became quieter in public and more accommodating in private. She told herself this was maturity. That real love wasn't about constant affirmation, it was about stability. But stability without mutual presence felt hollow. There were moments, small piercing ones, when the distance became impossible to ignore. Like the night she won an internal award at work and Richard left early because he had a call with investors. Or the weekend she suggested a short trip, just the two of them, and he replied, "That's not really necessary." Necessary. The word lodged itself in her chest. What was necessary then? And for whom? Marianne didn't ask out loud. She was still operating under the old rule. Don't make things harder than they need to be. But something inside her was beginning to resist that rule. Quietly. Persistently. She started noticing her own silence, not as peace, but as absence. And absence, once recognized, is hard to ignore. By the time the dinner incident happened, the one Richard would later call embarrassing, Marianne had already been carrying years of unspoken restraint. The question she asked that night wasn't provocative. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simply honest. And honesty, she was learning, threatened systems built on control. Looking back, Marianne could see that the humiliation in the bedroom hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long-standing imbalance finally exposed by one unscripted moment. Richard hadn't been angry about the question. He'd been unsettled by the loss of control. Understanding that didn't make the words hurt less. But it gave them context. And context is powerful. Because once you see the structure you're living inside, you can't unsee it. Marianne didn't yet know what she would do with that awareness. But she knew this much. She was no longer willing to be managed. And whatever came next would require a version of her that didn't fit neatly into anyone else's image. Marianne used to believe humiliation was loud. She thought it came with raised voices, sharp words, public scenes, the kinds of moments people could point to later and say, "That was wrong." She didn't recognize it in its quieter forms. Not at first. Because what she lived with wasn't explosive. It was instructional. Humiliation in her marriage arrived disguised as guidance, as refinement, as concern for appearances. It came in the form of suggestions meant to help her navigate Richard's world more effectively. "You don't need to explain yourself so much," he'd say, gently, after a dinner party. "It makes people uncomfortable when you go into details." Or, "Next time maybe let me answer that. It's just easier." Easier for whom? Marianne never asked. At first she nodded. Took mental notes. Adjusted. She told herself this was part of being married to someone whose life unfolded in public. She believed there were rules she simply hadn't learned yet, and that Richard, experienced and confident, was teaching her. She didn't see it as erasure. She saw it as adaptation. But adaptation has a cost when it only flows one way. The moments that chipped away at her weren't dramatic enough to confront. They lived in the space between intention and impact. In the tone Richard used when correcting her, not unkind, just firm. In the way he framed her missteps as inconveniences rather than hurts. "You know how these people are," he'd say. "They expect a certain Polish..." Marianne would apologize. though she couldn't always identify the offense. Over time she learned to preempt correction by monitoring herself. She softened opinions before they reached her tongue. She redirected conversations instinctively. She smiled through moments that left her feeling strangely small. And because nothing ever exploded, she told herself nothing was truly wrong. Friends admired her composure. They told her she handled pressure well. They envied her life, her access, her proximity to success. Marianne listened politely, wondering why she felt increasingly detached from the person they were describing. At night, lying beside Richard, she replayed conversations in her mind, not to savor them, but to critique herself. Should I have phrased that differently? Did I talk too long? Was that question unnecessary? She became both participant and editor of her own existence. The danger of normalization is that it dulls your instincts. When humiliation becomes routine, it stops registering as harm. It becomes background noise, something you learn to work around. And Marianne had always been good at working around things. She remembered a dinner months before the breaking point. A guest had asked her about her nonprofit work, genuinely curious. Marianne answered honestly, describing a program she was proud of. Halfway through her explanation, Richard interrupted with a polite laugh. "What Marianne means is that it's a small initiative," he said. "Nothing too complicated." The guest nodded, conversation redirected. Later in the car, Marianne mentioned it quietly. "I don't think I explained it wrong." Richard sighed, one hand on the steering wheel. "I wasn't correcting you. I was streamlining." Streamlining. The word landed heavier than he intended. Marianne looked out the window, the city lights blurring past. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. She filed the moment away with all the others. Unremarkable on their own, but heavy in accumulation. That night she dreamed she was speaking to a room full of people who couldn't hear her. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She woke with her heart racing, and told herself it was nothing. Just stress. But stress, she was beginning to realize, was often the body noticing what the mind tried to ignore. The more she adjusted, the more invisible she felt. And invisibility, unlike conflict, doesn't give you a clear moment to push back. It erodes slowly, quietly. It convinces you that disappearing is the same as being peaceful. Marianne didn't yet call it humiliation. She called it marriage. It wasn't until the night in the bedroom, when Richard finally said out loud what had been implied for years, that she saw the pattern in full. "You should learn when to stay quiet." That sentence hadn't introduced something new, it had simply removed the polish. Now, sitting alone with the memory of that moment, Marianne could trace the line backward clearly. Every small adjustment, every swallowed thought, every apology she'd offered for taking up space. She understood something important then, not with anger, but with precision. Humiliation doesn't always break you loudly. Sometimes it teaches you to break yourself. And once you see that lesson for what it is, you have a choice. Keep accepting it. Or stop. Marianne didn't know yet what stopping would cost her. But she knew exactly what continuing would. And for the first time the cost felt too high. The hardest part wasn't realizing something was wrong. It was accepting how long she'd lived with it. Once Marianne named what she'd been experiencing, not aloud, not yet, but privately, everything sharpened. Moments she'd once brushed past returned with clarity. Not exaggerated. Not dramatized. Just seen clearly for what they were. The silence after she spoke. The way conversations subtly rerouted away from her input. The compliments that praised her for being easy rather than thoughtful. None of it felt neutral anymore. She began to notice how often her body reacted before her mind did. The slight tightening in her chest when she was interrupted. The shallow breath she took before speaking in public. The way her shoulders lifted instinctively, as if bracing. These weren't personality traits. They were adaptations. And adaptations, she was learning, could be unlearned, but not without discomfort. One evening, Richard asked her opinion on an upcoming event. A small thing. Ordinarily, she would have mirrored his thoughts, softened her answer to align with what she assumed he wanted. This time she paused. "I don't think it's necessary," she said carefully. "It feels performative." Richard looked at her, surprised. Performative? Yes. The word hung between them. Marianne waited for the familiar response, the correction, the reframing, the explanation of why she was overthinking again. Instead, Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've been using that tone lately." "What tone?" she asked. "The one where you think you're right." The comment was meant to sting lightly, wrapped in humor. Marianne felt it register, and then passed through her without lodging. "I do think I'm right sometimes," she said calmly. Silence followed. Not explosive, just thick. Marianne realized then that unlearning wasn't about confrontation, it was about refusing to retreat when discomfort showed up. About staying present in moments where she'd once disappeared. Later that night, alone in the guest room, she wrote in a notebook she'd recently started keeping again. No polished thoughts. No self-censorship. Just honesty. "I'm not asking for more than respect. I just stopped asking for less." The words steadied her. Over the next few days, she practiced small acts of alignment. Not rebellion. Alignment. She answered emails without apologizing for her availability. She declined invitations without justification. She spoke in meetings without softening every statement. Nothing dramatic happened. And that, she realized, was the point. The world didn't collapse when she stopped shrinking. People didn't abandon her. The sky didn't fall. What did happen was subtler, and more telling. Some people adjusted. Some didn't. And that difference began to matter. Richard, in particular, seemed unsettled by the change. Not angry. Just disoriented. He wasn't used to resistance that didn't announce itself. He was accustomed to persuasion, to logic, to quiet compliance. Marianne wasn't arguing. She was simply no longer available for erasure. One night he asked, "Are you unhappy?" The question felt genuine, but incomplete. "I've been disconnected," she replied. He frowned. "From what?" She considered that too. "From myself." He didn't know what to do with that answer. And for the first time, Marianne didn't rush to translate it for him. That was another lesson she was learning. Clarity didn't require consensus. Unlearning old patterns wasn't linear. Some days she felt grounded and steady. Other days, guilt crept in. Old voices whispering that she was being difficult, ungrateful, cold. On those days, she reminded herself why she'd stayed silent for so long. Not because she lacked strength, but because silence had once felt safer. Safety, she was discovering, wasn't the same as health. She began walking more, writing more, sitting with herself without distraction. The more she did, the clearer everything became. She wasn't angry at Richard. She was done disappearing for him. And that distinction mattered. Because anger seeks reaction, but self-respect seeks alignment. Marianne didn't know yet where this path would lead. Whether the marriage would bend or break. Whether Richard could meet her where she now stood. But she knew something essential had already happened. She had reclaimed her voice, not by raising it, but by keeping it. And once reclaimed, it wasn't something she was willing to negotiate again. The morning light arrived without ceremony. It slid through the tall windows of the dining room, settling on polished surfaces and white linen, revealing everything exactly as it was. The long table was already set when Marianne entered, china aligned perfectly, silverware measured to the inch, coffee steaming at precise intervals. Order had always been Richard's preference. Guests began to arrive shortly after. Investors first, then friends, then family. Each greeted with warmth, each guided to their seats with practiced ease. Laughter filled the room, light and controlled, the sound of people who understood how to behave in spaces like this. Marianne moved among them calmly. She wasn't performing. She wasn't bracing. She was simply present. Richard watched her from the head of the table, noting the difference immediately. It wasn't in her posture, she'd always been composed. It wasn't in her tone, still warm, still polite. It was in what she wasn't doing. She wasn't scanning his face for approval. She wasn't adjusting her words mid-sentence. She wasn't shrinking to fit the moment. When she took her seat, she didn't wait for him to begin. She poured her own coffee, buttered her toast, looked around the table with a quiet steadiness that made the room feel subtly rebalanced. Conversation flowed as usual, market trends, travel plans, polite updates. But something underneath it shifted. When a guest asked Marianne about her work, she answered fully. Not defensively. Not apologetically. She didn't rush through the explanation or soften it for convenience. Richard noticed the attention turn toward her. Not dramatically, not abruptly. Just enough. When someone interrupted her, she paused, and continued when they finished. Her voice didn't sharpen. She didn't compete. She simply held her place. The table noticed. People leaned in. Heads tilted. Someone nodded thoughtfully at a point she made. Another asked a follow-up question. Not Richard but her. That, more than anything, changed the air. Richard attempted to redirect the conversation once, smoothly inserting a comment meant to shift focus. Marianne didn't counter it. She didn't challenge him. She waited. And when the conversation circled back to her, she picked up where she'd left off. Not stubbornly. Not triumphantly. Naturally. The effect was immediate and unsettling. This wasn't defiance. This wasn't rebellion. It was presence. And presence, unaccustomed, can feel like exposure. The guests felt it even if they couldn't name it. Something in the rhythm of the morning had altered. Not broken, just recalibrated. By the time breakfast plates were cleared, the room held a different kind of quiet. Not awkward, reflective. When the last guest stood to leave, one of them lingered briefly, touching Marianne's arm. "It was lovely hearing your perspective this morning," she said. "You have such a grounded way of explaining things." Marianne smiled. "Thank you." Richard heard it. He felt something tighten, not anger, but awareness. A realization that something he'd taken for granted had shifted beyond his control. When the house finally emptied, the silence that followed was heavier than the one the night before. Richard cleared his throat. "You seemed different today." Marianne collected the napkins calmly. "I felt like myself." He hesitated. "You don't think that made things uncomfortable?" She looked at him then, not challenging, not apologetic. Just clear. For whom? The question wasn't accusatory. It was honest. Richard didn't answer. Marianne turned back to the table, stacking dishes, aware of how grounded she felt. Not victorious. Not confrontational. Aligned. She didn't know how the morning would ripple outward, what it would change, what it might cost her. She only knew that for the first time in years, she hadn't disappeared to keep the peace. And somehow, the peace felt more real than ever. The house felt larger once everyone was gone. Not emptier, just exposed. The kind of silence that doesn't rush to fill itself. The kind that waits. Marianne carried the last stack of plates to the kitchen and set them in the sink. She rolled up her sleeves and turned on the water, letting it run warm over her hands before reaching for the soap. The routine grounded her. Simple movements. Familiar weight. Behind her, Richard stood in the doorway, longer than necessary. "You didn't need to do all that," he said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Do what?" He shifted, uncomfortable with the question. "Speak the way you did. Draw attention." Marianne returned to the dishes. "I answered questions. That's not what I mean." His voice stayed level, but there was an edge now, something sharpened by the loss of control. "There's a way things usually go." She nodded slightly. "I know." The admission caught him off guard. "And you chose not to follow it," he said. "Yes." The word was quiet. Final. Not defensive. Not explained. Richard exhaled slowly. "You made people uncomfortable." Marianne turned off the faucet and faced him fully. Her hands were wet, her sleeves damp, her posture relaxed. "I think some people noticed a difference," she said. "That's not the same thing." He frowned. "You're being difficult." The phrase used to land hard. It used to send her spiraling inward, searching for where she'd gone wrong. This time, it passed through her. "I'm being honest," she replied. "There's a difference." Richard looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and not liking what he found. "You've been doing this lately," he said. Pulling away. "Sleeping in the other room. Acting like I did something unforgivable." Marianne didn't raise her voice. "You told me to learn when to stay quiet." He scoffed lightly. "You're taking that out of context." She shook her head. "No, I'm finally hearing it in context." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they'd had before, not because it was tense, but because there was nowhere to retreat. Richard wasn't used to that. He was used to explanations. To logic. To conversations that bent back toward his framing. Marianne wasn't bending. "I don't know what you want from me," he said. She thought about that carefully before answering. "I want to be spoken to with respect. I want to be present without being managed. And I don't want to shrink to make things easier." Richard's jaw tightened. "You know how much pressure I'm under." "I do," she said. "But pressure doesn't excuse dismissal." The words were calm. Measured. Unemotional. That was what unsettled him most. He turned away first. Marianne watched him leave the room, her chest steady, her breath even. She didn't feel victorious. She felt clear. Later that afternoon, she went for a walk. The park greeted her with the same quiet familiarity as before. Leaves stirring, footsteps passing, life continuing without commentary. She sat on the same bench and let the moment settle. She wasn't naive. She knew this shift would have consequences. That choosing herself might cost her comfort, certainty, even the marriage she'd built her adult life around. But she also knew the alternative. Returning to silence would cost her more. For the first time, she let herself imagine a future that wasn't organized around someone else's approval. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't sparkle. It simply felt breathable. Back at the house that evening, Richard didn't ask her to return to their room. Marianne didn't offer. They moved around each other carefully, like people relearning shared space. That night, as she lay in the guest room again, Marianne understood something important. The morning hadn't stunned the guests because she'd changed who she was. It had stunned them because she'd stopped hiding. And once you stop hiding, there's no clean way to go back. That morning didn't change the room because she spoke louder. It changed because she stopped shrinking. If you've ever felt the weight of staying quiet just to keep things comfortable, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever realized that your silence was costing you more than your honesty ever would? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience may help someone else find their voice. And if you're drawn to love stories that reveal real emotional growth, self-respect and quiet strength, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. The journey is just getting deeper. The days that followed didn't explode. They stretched. Marianne had expected something louder, an argument, a confrontation, a demand that things return to the way they were. Instead, what filled the house was distance. Not hostile. Not cold. Just unfamiliar. Richard became polite. Careful. He asked practical questions. Commented on schedules. Discussed logistics as if the emotional shift between them were a minor disruption that could be managed with enough structure. Marianne noticed. Politeness, she realized, could be another way to avoid truth. She moved through her days with intention. She woke early, not to accommodate Richard's schedule, but to sit with herself before the world made its requests. She drank her coffee by the window. Took walks without explaining where she was going. Answered messages when she was ready, not immediately. None of it was dramatic. All of it was new. At work, colleagues commented on the change without quite naming it. "You seem lighter," one of them said during a meeting. Marianne smiled. She didn't explain. She was beginning to understand that not every shift required narration. The real work was happening internally. She caught herself mid-thought sometimes, about to apologize for taking time, about to soften a statement she believed in, and stopped. She let the discomfort pass without acting on it. That, she discovered, was harder than confrontation. Discomfort had always been her cue to retreat. Now, she stayed. Richard noticed her staying. One evening he asked, "Are you planning to leave?" The question wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was strategic, like someone assessing risk. Marianne looked at him across the kitchen counter. "I'm planning to be honest," she said. "With myself first." "That doesn't answer my question." "It does," she replied gently. "Just not in the way you want." Richard leaned back, arms crossed. "You're changing the rules." She shook her head. "I'm noticing them." That distinction mattered. She wasn't rewriting history. She was reading it clearly for the first time. They tried to have conversations about the future, but they kept circling the same impasse. Richard wanted reassurance without adjustment. He wanted her calm without her clarity. He wanted harmony, but only if it didn't require him to look too closely at his own role in its construction. Marianne wasn't angry about that. She was simply unwilling to participate in it anymore. Late one afternoon she returned to the study, the room that had once held her old notebooks and abandoned ideas. She sat at the desk and opened a fresh page. "What do I want?" she wrote. The answer didn't come immediately. That surprised her. For years, she'd been so focused on managing other people's expectations that she'd lost touch with her own. Wanting felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent. She didn't force an answer. She closed the notebook and went for another walk. At the park, she watched a woman teaching her child how to ride a bike. The child wobbled, fell, stood up again. No one rushed to fix it. No one scolded the imbalance away. Marianne felt something shift in her chest. Learning, she realized, required instability. Back home, Richard was on a call. His voice carried from the office, confident, controlled, certain. She listened for a moment, not with resentment, but with recognition. This was the version of him the world knew. The version she'd been asked to orbit around. She no longer wanted to orbit. That evening, they ate dinner separately. Not as a statement, as a reflection of where they were. Marianne took her plate to the guest room and ate slowly, reading a book she'd been meaning to finish for years. The quiet felt intentional now, not imposed. Before sleeping she wrote again. "I'm not leaving yet," she admitted to herself. "But I'm not staying the way I was either." The honesty steadied her. She didn't need to decide everything at once. Disentangling, she was learning, wasn't about abrupt exits. It was about reclaiming agency one choice at a time. And for the first time that felt possible. The idea of separation didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as a question Marianne kept returning to, quietly, the way you test a word on your tongue before speaking it aloud. What would my life look like if I didn't keep adjusting it for someone else? At first, the thought scared her. Not because she doubted her strength, but because so much of her adult identity had been built around accommodation, around being useful, around fitting neatly into someone else's structure. Standing alone felt unfamiliar. But unfamiliar didn't mean impossible. She began with practical things, small grounding actions that reminded her she could move through the world without asking permission. She reviewed her finances one afternoon, sitting at the dining table long after Richard had left for work. She didn't panic. She didn't rush. She simply looked at the numbers with clear eyes. She could support herself. That knowledge settled into her bones with quiet reassurance. She updated her resume, reconnected with an old colleague, took a lunch meeting without worrying whether it conflicted with Richard's schedule. None of these things were dramatic, but each one loosened a thread she'd once believed was tightly knotted. Emotionally, the disentanglement was slower. There were moments, late at night usually, when grief surfaced unexpectedly. Not grief for the man Richard was, but for the version of herself she'd given up believing in. The woman who'd once imagined a life shaped by curiosity instead of caution. On those nights, Marianne didn't push the feelings away. She sat with them. She learned that strength wasn't the absence of sadness, it was the willingness to feel it without letting it dictate her choices. Richard noticed the shifts. "You're making plans without me," he said one evening. Not accusing, but unsettled. "I'm making plans," Marianne replied. "That's not the same thing." He didn't respond immediately. He was used to being central, if not emotionally, then structurally. Marianne's independence challenged a balance he hadn't realized depended so heavily on her compliance. "You're pulling away," he said finally. She nodded. "I'm pulling inward." The difference mattered. She wasn't running from him. She was returning to herself. There were conversations they couldn't avoid, about logistics, about expectations, about what this change meant. Richard approached them like negotiations, looking for outcomes, compromises that would restore equilibrium without requiring self-examination. Marianne approached them differently. She spoke plainly. She didn't over-explain. She didn't defend her need for space. When she didn't know the answer, she said so. That honesty frustrated him more than anger ever could. "You used to be easier," he said one night, not unkindly. Marianne met his gaze. "I used to be quieter." That was the truth of it. Quiet had been her currency. Silence her offering. And she'd spent it generously, believing it bought security. Now she understood it had only bought time. As the weeks passed, Marianne felt something unexpected emerge beneath the uncertainty. Relief. She slept better. She laughed more easily, with friends, with coworkers, even with herself. She noticed how often she'd once anticipated criticism that never came. How many apologies she no longer needed. She wasn't fearless. But she was no longer afraid of her own voice. One afternoon, while walking through the park again, Marianne sat on the same bench and realized something profound. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for permission, not for approval. Not for someone else to decide when she was allowed to change. She had already begun. Standing alone didn't feel like isolation. It felt like alignment. And that, she realized, was the foundation she'd been missing all along. Marianne wasn't looking for anything when she met Daniel Brooks. That was what surprised her most later, not that she felt drawn to him, but that the connection arrived without urgency, without performance, without the familiar tightening in her chest that usually accompanied new attention. They met at a community art fundraiser on a quiet Thursday evening. Marianne had almost skipped it. Long day, low energy. But she'd promised herself she wouldn't make decisions based on shrinking anymore, and she'd wanted to go. Daniel was standing near a series of black and white photographs, hands in his pockets, studying them with genuine interest. Not the distracted kind, the kind where someone actually looks. Marianne paused beside him, drawn by the same image. "It feels unfinished," she said without thinking. "Like it's waiting for the viewer to bring something to it." Daniel turned, surprised, but not startled. He smiled slightly. That's exactly what I was thinking. I couldn't figure out why I kept coming back to it. There was no rush to fill the silence that followed. No immediate follow-up question meant to keep the exchange alive. Just a shared moment of recognition. They introduced themselves. Talked briefly about the exhibit. When a mutual acquaintance joined them, Daniel stepped back easily, giving space without withdrawing completely. Marianne noticed that too. Later, when she mentioned she needed to leave early, Daniel didn't protest. He didn't joke about it or try to negotiate for more time. "Thanks for telling me," he said simply. "I enjoyed talking with you." The sentence stayed with her longer than she expected. Not because it was romantic, but because it was respectful. They exchanged numbers without ceremony. Days passed before either of them reached out. When they did, the conversation unfolded slowly. Messages were thoughtful, not constant. Questions were asked, and answered. When Marianne said she wasn't free, Daniel accepted it without probing. When he shared something personal, it wasn't to impress, just to be known. Attraction grew in the absence of pressure. Marianne felt herself relaxing into the connection in a way that was unfamiliar. She didn't feel the need to edit her words or anticipate reactions. When she set boundaries, they were met with understanding rather than challenge. Daniel didn't rush intimacy. He didn't treat her availability like a prize to be won. He seemed comfortable with pacing, with uncertainty, with letting things develop as they would. That comfort made space for honesty. On their third meeting, coffee, quiet corner, no agenda, Marianne mentioned her marriage. Not in detail, not as a confession, just a fact. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He didn't try to position himself as an alternative. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said. "I want to be clear about something too. I'm not interested in being an escape. Only a choice." The words landed gently and firmly. Marianne felt something steady settle inside her. Respect, she realized, wasn't dramatic. It didn't sweep you off your feet. It met you at eye level. They continued seeing each other with care. Walks, conversations, shared silences that didn't feel empty. When disagreements arose, they were named early, without blame, without deflection. Still, the unfamiliarity of this kind of connection stirred old fears. Marianne caught herself waiting for the moment Daniel would push, would test her boundaries, would ask her to compromise something essential to keep the peace. When that moment didn't come, it unsettled her. Healing, she was learning, could feel unsafe simply because it didn't follow old patterns. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about expectations and timing, Marianne pulled back emotionally. Not intentionally, but instinctively. Old habits resurfacing. Daniel noticed. "I care about you," he said calmly, "but I won't guess what you need. Tell me when you're ready." No pursuit, no guilt, no pressure, just presence. Marianne went home that night and sat with the unfamiliar ache in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. For the first time, attraction wasn't asking her to disappear. It was asking her to stay. Marianne didn't pull away because of Daniel. She pulled away because she didn't recognize the version of herself she was becoming around him. There was no tension to manage, no mood to anticipate, no unspoken rule about how much space she was allowed to take. Daniel listened without scanning for exits. He spoke without positioning himself above her. He didn't rush moments or stretch them for effect. The absence of friction felt strange. It reminded her how long she'd lived braced for it. On a quiet evening walk, they talked about small things, books they loved, places they'd lived, the ways their work had shaped them. Daniel shared stories without polishing them. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he needed time alone, he named it clearly. Marianne admired that ease. It made her uneasy. That night, after she returned home, she lay awake replaying the conversation. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because nothing had. Her nervous system, accustomed to vigilance, didn't know what to do with peace. The next time Daniel reached out, Marianne responded politely but distantly. She told herself she needed space. She told herself it was too soon. She told herself she was being responsible. All of it was partly true. But underneath, there was fear. Fear of wanting something she might lose. Fear of trusting a dynamic she didn't know how to survive inside yet. Daniel noticed the shift and named it. Not with accusation, but with clarity. "You don't owe me consistency," he said during their next conversation. "But I want to understand what's happening if you're open to sharing." Marianne hesitated. The old instinct, to deflect, to minimize, rose up quickly. Instead, she told the truth. "I'm not used to this," she said. Being heard without having to manage the outcome. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense. He didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't promise anything he couldn't guarantee. He simply stayed present. "We can go at whatever pace feels respectful to you," he said. "As long as we're honest." That was the condition. Honesty, not endurance. Marianne went home that night and wrote in her notebook again. "I confuse calm with emptiness because I was trained to feel needed, not safe." The realization landed gently and decisively. The next time she saw Daniel, she didn't pull away. She leaned in, not physically but emotionally. She spoke openly about her fears, about her marriage, about the ways she'd learned to disappear in order to stay loved. Daniel listened without interrupting, without reframing, without trying to fix it. When she finished, he said, "I don't want to be someone you lose yourself with. I want to be someone you stay yourself around." Marianne felt her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with relief. Love, she was learning, didn't require her to abandon her boundaries. It asked her to trust them. That trust didn't erase conflict. It changed how conflict was handled. When disagreements arose, they named them early. They didn't let resentment ferment. They spoke from experience rather than assumption. When one needed space, the other didn't interpret it as rejection. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Marianne noticed how different she felt afterward. Steadier, not drained. Present, not vigilant. She didn't need to rehearse conversations or soften truths. She could just be. And that, more than anything, revealed how heavy her previous life had been. Still, there were nights when guilt crept in. Old voices whispering that she was moving too quickly, that she owed her marriage more patience, more sacrifice. On those nights she reminded herself, choosing health wasn't betrayal. It was survival. And survival didn't need to be justified. Marianne didn't know yet how everything would resolve. With Richard, with Daniel, with the future she was quietly assembling. But she knew this. Love that required her to disappear was no longer an option. And love that met her in honesty, without urgency, without erasure, was something she was finally willing to step toward. The closer Marianne grew to something healthy, the louder her old fears became. They didn't announce themselves as warnings. They arrived as reasonable thoughts, dressed in responsibility and restraint. "You're moving too fast. You should be more careful. You don't want to hurt anyone." Those thoughts felt familiar, safe. They'd guided her for years. What she was learning now was how often they had guided her away from herself. Her life existed in two parallel lanes. With Daniel, everything felt grounded, mutual, steady. With Richard, everything felt suspended. Unfinished conversations, logistical coordination, emotional distance that no longer pretended to be intimacy. She was careful not to blur those lines. She didn't rush decisions. She didn't dramatize the in-between. She gave herself time. Still, tension grew, not from conflict, but from contrast. One evening, Daniel invited her to a small gathering at a friend's place. Nothing formal. Just people he cared about. The invitation was simple, unpressured. Marianne hesitated. In the past, introductions like that had felt like auditions. Moments where she'd needed to present the most agreeable version of herself. Where missteps were noted, remembered, corrected later. Daniel noticed her pause. "There's no expectation," he said gently. "If you'd rather not, that's completely okay." The ease of that response unsettled her more than pressure ever had. She agreed to go. The evening was unremarkable in the best way. Conversation flowed naturally. No one spoke over her. No one corrected her stories. Daniel didn't monitor her interactions or steer conversations away from her voice. At one point, someone asked her opinion on a topic Daniel disagreed with. Marianne felt the old instinct flare. To soften, to retreat, to defer. She didn't. She spoke honestly. Daniel listened, and disagreed respectfully. The exchange ended with mutual curiosity, not dominance. Later on the drive home, Marianne stared out the window, heart beating faster than she expected. "You okay?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she said slowly. "Just noticing how different this feels." He nodded. Different can be disorienting. That night, lying alone in the guest room at her house, Marianne felt the familiar pull of guilt. Richard had been quiet lately. Not cruel. Not demanding. Just withdrawn. The absence felt heavy, not because she missed the relationship, but because she recognized the part of herself that wanted to fix it out of obligation. She questioned herself. Am I abandoning something I should try harder to save? Am I choosing ease over commitment? The questions circled until she forced herself to answer honestly. She wasn't choosing ease. She was choosing health. And health, she was learning, often felt harder at first. The next day, Richard asked to talk. They sat across from each other in the living room, the same space where so many quiet compromises had once been made. "You've changed," he said again. But this time without irritation. "And I don't know how to reach you." Marianne folded her hands in her lap. "I don't think you ever reached me," she said. "You reached the version of me that stayed quiet." The words were calm. Clear. Richard leaned back. "So, what are you saying?" She took a breath. "I'm saying I need space to live honestly. And I can't do that while being managed." He stared at the floor for a long moment. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," she said. "But intention doesn't undo impact." That was new language for her. Language she hadn't allowed herself to use before. The conversation didn't resolve everything. It didn't need to. What mattered was that she didn't backtrack. She didn't apologize for clarity. Later that week, Daniel noticed her distraction. "You seem heavier today," he said. Marianne considered brushing it off. Instead, she told the truth. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of choosing something good, and still feeling like I'm doing something wrong." Daniel listened carefully. "That sounds like an old rule talking," he said. "Not a current one." The words landed softly, and accurately. Marianne smiled faintly. "I think you're right." She was beginning to understand something essential. Self-respect isn't proven once. It's practiced when old fears try to take over, and love, when it's healthy, doesn't punish you for choosing yourself. It stands with you while you learn how. Marianne had spent most of her life believing honesty was dangerous. Not because truth itself was harmful, but because of what usually followed it. Tension, withdrawal, correction. Honesty, in her experience, often required repair work. Apologies. Explanations. Softening. With Daniel, honesty didn't demand any of that. It required presence. One evening, sitting across from him at a small cafe, Marianne felt the weight of everything she hadn't said pressing at the edges of her calm. Not secrets, she had none. But the fullness of her fear, the kind you only share when you're no longer trying to manage someone else's response. "I need to tell you something," she said. Daniel set his cup down. "I'm listening." She took a breath. "I don't always trust that what we're building can last. Not because of you, because I'm still learning how to live without bracing." Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't reassure prematurely. He let the truth arrive fully before responding. "That makes sense," he said. "You've been surviving a long time. Safety can feel unfamiliar." Marianne nodded. "Sometimes I feel like I'm waiting for the cost. Like there has to be one." He smiled gently. "What if the cost is just learning to receive something good?" The question settled into her slowly. She thought about how often she'd believed love had to be earned through endurance, through patience, through sacrifice of self. She realized how deeply that belief had shaped her choices. Daniel continued. "I don't want you to promise anything you're not ready for. I don't need certainty from you. I just need honesty." The simplicity of that felt revolutionary. Marianne felt her shoulders relax, her breath deepen. She wasn't being asked to guarantee a future. She was being asked to show up as she was. That night, she went home and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next few days unfolded with quiet steadiness. Conversations with Daniel grew richer, not heavier. They talked about expectations, fears, boundaries, not as obstacles, but as information. When Marianne needed time, she said so. When Daniel needed space, he named it. Neither interpreted distance as rejection. Trust grew not from intensity but from consistency. Meanwhile, Richard remained a presence in her life, but no longer the center of it. They spoke when necessary, handled logistics, acknowledged the reality of what was changing without dramatizing it. There were moments when old habits tugged at Marianne, urging her to comfort, to reassure, to smooth. She didn't. She noticed the impulse, and let it pass. One afternoon, while packing a few personal items from the house, Marianne paused in the doorway of the bedroom she'd once shared. She didn't feel bitterness. She didn't feel regret. She felt gratitude, for the clarity, for the lesson, for the strength she'd found only by standing still long enough to see what wasn't working. Later that evening, she told Daniel she'd decided to move out. Not impulsively. Not emotionally. Deliberately. He didn't celebrate. He didn't pressure her. He simply asked, "How do you feel about it?" Marianne thought carefully. "Steady," she said. He nodded. "Then I'm glad." That response stayed with her. Love, she was learning, didn't rush your decisions. It respected them. As she settled into a new space, smaller, simpler, hers, Marianne noticed how different life felt when it wasn't organized around anticipation of conflict. She decorated slowly, chose furniture intentionally, built routines that supported her instead of shrinking her. Daniel visited sometimes. Other times, he didn't. Their relationship unfolded without urgency, without performance. And in that space, something profound happened. Marianne stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. She stopped believing that love had to cost her something essential. Honesty hadn't destroyed the connection. It had strengthened it. Because honesty, when met with respect, doesn't fracture love. It becomes the bridge that carries it forward. Marianne's new apartment didn't impress anyone. That was part of what she loved about it. The building was older, the floors slightly uneven, the windows framed by chipped paint that caught the light in soft, forgiving ways. It didn't announce status or success. It simply offered space. Her space. She unpacked slowly, refusing the old urge to rush and make things look finished. Boxes stayed open for days. Books stacked where they landed. A chair angled toward the window because the light felt right there. No one corrected her choices. No one needed convincing. For the first time in years, Marianne noticed how much energy she'd once spent maintaining an image of harmony, of ease, of having everything under control. Here, alone, there was nothing to manage. She woke early most mornings, not from anxiety, but from quiet readiness. Coffee tasted better. Silence felt intentional. She moved through her days without the low hum of vigilance she'd once mistaken for normal. Peace, she realized, wasn't something you borrowed between conflicts. It was something you built. Richard called occasionally, brief logistical conversations. He sounded polite, distant. She responded in kind. There was sadness there, yes, but also relief. The grief didn't feel consuming. It felt appropriate. Marianne no longer tried to comfort him through his discomfort. That had been part of the old pattern. With Daniel, things continued to unfold at a pace that honored both of them. They spent time together without needing to fill every moment. Sometimes they cooked. Sometimes they walked. Sometimes they sat quietly, reading side by side. The absence of pressure allowed affection to deepen organically. One evening, Daniel noticed the change in her apartment. Not in the decor, but in her. "You seem settled," he said. Marianne considered the word. "I feel aligned." He smiled. "That's good." It was. It was better than good. Still, choosing herself didn't mean the absence of doubt. There were days when old voices resurfaced, reminding her of expectations she'd stepped away from, questioning whether she'd done enough to save the marriage. On those days, Marianne returned to the truth that steadied her. She hadn't left because things were hard. She'd left because staying required her to disappear. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, she ran into an old acquaintance at the grocery store. After a few pleasantries, the woman lowered her voice. "I heard about you and Richard," she said. "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." Marianne smiled gently. It was clarifying. The woman blinked, unsure how to respond. Marianne didn't elaborate. She didn't need to justify her peace. That evening, she walked through her neighborhood alone, noticing small details she'd once rushed past. The way the light hit brick walls, the sound of someone practicing piano with a window open, the steady rhythm of her own steps. She felt present in her body in a way she hadn't in years. Later, sitting with Daniel on her couch, she shared something she hadn't said out loud before. "I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore," she said. "Not for permission. Not for the other shoe to drop." Daniel nodded. "That sounds like trust." "It is," she replied. "In myself." That was the turning point. Not a declaration of love. Not a promise of forever. Just the quiet realization that she trusted her own judgment again. And that trust made room for love to exist without fear. Marianne fell asleep that night with the windows open, the city's hum a gentle backdrop. She didn't dream of conflict or correction. Love felt different when it wasn't tangled in fear. Marianne noticed it in small, unremarkable moments, the kind she once overlooked because they didn't announce themselves loudly. Sitting across from Daniel at a quiet diner, sharing fries without conversation, walking side by side without needing to fill the silence. Disagreeing about something minor, and realizing afterward, that nothing inside her felt threatened. She wasn't bracing anymore. That realization surprised her more than anything else. In her past, love had always come with instructions, unspoken rules about how much space she could take, how visible she was allowed to be. Even on good days there had been a part of her monitoring the atmosphere, making sure nothing tipped too far into discomfort. With Daniel, that part of her rested. Not because he reassured her constantly, but because his actions were consistent. When he said he would show up, he did. When he needed time, he asked for it without blame. When Marianne set boundaries, he didn't test them to see how firm they were. Trust grew quietly, built on what didn't happen as much as what did. No manipulation, no scorekeeping, no subtle corrections disguised as concern. One evening, they talked openly about what they wanted, not in grand declarations, but in practical truths. "I want a life where I don't have to shrink to keep love," Marianne said. Daniel nodded. "I want a partner who chooses me freely, not out of obligation." The alignment felt steady, not intoxicating. Marianne realized then how often she'd confused intensity with depth, how she'd believed love needed friction to feel real. This was different. This was calm, but not empty. Intentional. There were still moments when old reflexes surfaced. When Daniel was quiet, she caught herself wondering if she'd said something wrong. When he disagreed, she felt the familiar urge to retreat. But now she noticed the impulse without obeying it. She stayed. And each time she stayed, the reflex weakened. One afternoon, Daniel invited her to meet his parents. Not as a milestone, not as a test, just because it felt natural. Marianne felt a flicker of anxiety, the echo of past experiences where introductions had meant performance. She voiced it. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Not because of them, because of old habits." Daniel smiled gently. "Then let's not make it a big thing, just be yourself." That was the invitation, not to impress, not to adapt, to be. The visit was simple. Conversations were honest. No one corrected her stories or guided her responses. Daniel didn't hover or manage the interaction. He trusted her presence. On the drive home, Marianne realized something profound. She wasn't tired. In the past, social moments, even pleasant ones, had drained her. She'd returned home mentally exhausted from self-monitoring. This time, she felt full. Love, she was learning, didn't consume energy when it was rooted in respect. It returned it. Later that night, sitting together in comfortable quiet, Marianne felt a clarity settle in her chest. She loved Daniel. Not in a way that asked her to abandon herself. Not in a way that demanded proof. But in a way that felt earned, by honesty, by patience, by mutual regard. She said it without ceremony. "I love you." Daniel didn't rush his response. He didn't perform it. "I love you too," he said, steady and sure. The words didn't feel like a promise of forever. They felt like a truth of now. And that was enough. Marianne lay awake later, reflecting on how far she'd come. Not in miles or milestones, but in internal distance traveled. She hadn't just left a marriage. She had left a version of herself who believed love required endurance. She had stepped into a life where love was a choice, made daily, freely, without fear. And for the first time, she trusted that choice. Marianne no longer measured her days by how smoothly she kept the peace. That realization came to her one quiet morning as she stood at the kitchen window of her apartment, watching sunlight stretch across the floor. There was no tension in her body, no silent checklist running through her mind of what needed to be said, or not said, to make the day go well. The day was already going well, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Her life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Work no longer consumed her in the way it once had. She chose projects intentionally, declined others without apology. Her time felt like something she owned, not something she managed for someone else's comfort. With Daniel, love existed alongside that ownership. They spent time together without urgency, without the constant negotiation of space. Sometimes they planned weekends away. Sometimes they didn't. The connection didn't weaken in the absence of effort. It strengthened through mutual trust. One afternoon, sitting together at a small cafe, Daniel watched her trace the rim of her cup thoughtfully. "You seem different," he said. Marianne smiled. "I feel different. In a good way. In a grounded way." She told him how she'd been reflecting on her past, not with regret, but with gratitude for the clarity it had brought her. How every moment of discomfort had taught her something essential about herself. "I used to think love was something you held on to by enduring," she said. Now I see it's something you build by standing still. Daniel nodded, absorbing her words without interrupting. That sounds like growth, he said. It is, she replied. But it's also maintenance. She was learning that self-respect wasn't a destination you reached once and kept forever. It was a practice, a series of daily choices that required attention and honesty. There were moments when the old impulse to shrink resurfaced. She noticed it most when she was tired or overwhelmed. The urge to make things easier by saying less, wanting less. But now, she caught herself. She paused. She checked in. She chose differently. That choice had become a quiet habit. One evening, while walking through the neighborhood, Marianne passed a restaurant where she and Richard had once hosted friends. The memories surfaced without bitterness. She remembered the version of herself who'd stood in that room, smiling, managing, disappearing. She felt compassion for her. Not shame. She had done the best she could with the tools she had then. Now, she had better tools. Later that night, Daniel asked her something unexpected. Do you ever miss it? He said. The life you left? Marianne thought carefully. I miss who I thought I had to be, she said finally, but I don't miss living as her. The answer felt complete. They walked on in comfortable silence. The city around them alive but unintrusive. Marianne noticed how different the world felt when she wasn't bracing against it. She didn't feel protected by love anymore. She felt partnered by it. That distinction mattered. Love, in this form, wasn't a shield against life's difficulties. It was a steady presence that made facing them less lonely. Marianne understood now that self-respect wasn't something she'd chosen once in a moment of courage. It was something she chose every day, in how she spoke, how she listened, how she honored her own needs without apology. And in choosing it, she had found a love that didn't ask her to disappear. Marianne didn't wake up one day feeling finished. There was no final arrival, no sense that she had completed some invisible journey and could now rest forever. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable. She felt steady. That steadiness showed up in ordinary moments, in how she chose her words without rehearsing them first, in how she listened without bracing for correction, in how she allowed silence to exist without filling it out of habit. Love, she realized, had finally stopped feeling like something she needed to protect. It simply existed. On a Sunday morning, she and Daniel sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, sharing coffee and a newspaper. They weren't talking much. They didn't need to. The comfort between them wasn't built on constant affirmation, it was built on trust. At one point, Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Not to anchor her. Just because it felt right. Marianne smiled, the gesture warming her without overwhelming her. She thought about how different this was from the mornings she'd once spent at long tables, surrounded by people, performing composure while quietly disappearing. Back then, silence had felt heavy. Now, it felt supportive. Later that afternoon they walked through the park she'd come to know so well, the place where so many of her realizations had begun. Families picnicked. Couples strolled. Life moved forward without urgency. Daniel broke the silence. You know, he said, I never felt like I had to convince you of anything. Marianne considered that. That's because you didn't. They stopped at a bench and sat. The familiar rhythm of the place grounded her. She reflected on how much her understanding of love had changed. She no longer believed love was proven by sacrifice alone. She no longer believed endurance was the highest virtue. She believed love was proven by mutual respect, by safety, by the freedom to be fully present without self-erasure. I used to think choosing myself meant choosing loneliness, she said quietly. But it didn't. Daniel looked at her with steady affection. It just meant choosing honestly. That was the lesson she would carry forward. Marianne had not reclaimed her life through confrontation or drama. She hadn't exposed anyone, or demanded apologies. She had simply stopped explaining herself where explanation was never truly heard. She had chosen dignity, and in doing so, she had made room for a love that didn't compete with her sense of self, but stood beside it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the path, Marianne felt a deep gratitude, not for perfection but for clarity. Her past had taught her what it felt like to disappear. Her present taught her what it meant to stay. Love, she understood now, wasn't loud when it was healthy. It didn't rush or demand or correct. It settled. And when it settled, it felt like home. She stood from the bench, Daniel rising with her, and they continued walking, side by side, unhurried, whole. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything that mattered was aligned. And that was enough. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and sit with it. Have you ever realized that choosing yourself didn't cost you love, but finally showed you what real love looks like? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe love should feel safe, balanced, and earned, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. More stories like this are coming.